Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. This week on the show, we are answering 14 listener-submitted questions about the Whitetail Rut. And joining me is one of the very best bow hunters I know, Andy May. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light. And today, my friends, if you are listening to this when this podcast has just dropped, it is officially Sweet November. The rut is here for most of you across much of the country. And as you can see, I'm recording from the field out in the middle of somewhere on some kind of hunting trip. And my guest today is doing the same, not on a hunting trip, but he's in the field. I'm joined today by Mr. Andy May to help us do some rut Q&A. So thank you, Andy, for making time for this.
Yeah, man, no problem. Should be fun.
Yeah, it's the greatest time of the year, right? Are you ready for this? Are you ready for November?
I am, man. Yeah, it's always so exciting when November rolls around, because then you just you always have a chance in November. Like October is a little more detailed, you're a little more careful with your moves. You're trying to make I always call them like detailed strikes. And then once that rut hits, man, it's more like a marathon, and you're trying to be out there as much as possible and trying to catch the magic when it happens.
Yeah. So do you feel like when November hits, is that stressful for you or relief for you? Because I've actually been switching a little bit. I used to be looking forward to November the whole time, and then when it finally got here, I was like, okay, now's my chance. But now I actually feel like if I don't have a buck killed by the time November arrives, I'm actually stressed out, because now these deer are doing things that I'm not quite sure about what they're doing, and everything's kind of up in the air again, and you're trying to refigure it out. The old patterns from 4 weeks ago, aren't going to cut it anymore. So I have I'm excited, but it's a different thing in my head. Are you the same?
Yeah, a little bit. I think if I'm, if I'm after like a specific deer, and I really kind of have my heart set on that, I'm really dedicated to pursuing that one animal, it can be kind of a stressful time, because I mean, he can disappear for a week, and he's locked up with a doe or on a neighboring property or something like that, and you just can't seem to find him, and that can be a little stressful. But when I'm after, sorry about that noise.
No
When
problem.
I'm after, when I'm just out there and I'm after kind of like any buck, or any mature deer, and I'm not really setting my sights on a specific animal, I really like the rut. Um, when I travel out of state, many times I like to go during the rut, because I don't really have a specific deer that I'm going after. It's more, I want to see the rut action. I want that excitement. I want to see bucks chasing. I want to see bucks that are responding to calls, and it's just more fun. It's a little more exciting. But yeah, it can certainly be frustrating. It can be a frustrating time, especially if you get like a rut where you're just not seeing, you're not seeing any good deer. So it could be a tough time. But I tend to get excited about the rut. Like this year in particular, there's a handful of deer that I would shoot. There's not one that is head and shoulders above the rest. I'm just out there having fun, and I'm looking forward to it.
Are you going to do a big rut trip at any point this November, or are you doing local Michigan, Ohio stuff?
I think I'm going to stay local. I haven't really decided yet. If I did some traveling in June for hunting. I did some traveling in August for hunting, and then I went on a very short trip in September. And I knew that would kind of eat into my whitetail stuff a little bit, so I'm totally fine with it. Um, it's not that I couldn't take a short trip in November, but there's enough decent deer around home between Michigan and Ohio that I'd be content just kind of sticking around here and trying to get one of those deer on the ground.
Yeah. I'm still Still after my local buck too. So I don't.
Yeah.
I would not mind getting some quality time here during this period to get it done here as well. But
Yeah.
that said, we got a whole pile of questions from listeners last week with their specific situations that they want to run by
Okay.
us, Andy. So I was thinking for today's episode, we could just go through as many of these listener submitted questions as possible and try to knock out and help folks with the things that they're still, still have questions about. It's funny. You and me have talked about this in the past, Andy, that we've like kind of lamented, like, oh man, everyone's already said all the same stuff about hunting deer or hunting the rut. Every article's been written, every conversation's been had. There's nothing new to talk about, right?
Hmm.
We've worried about that. Like, is there anything new we can bring to the table? Is there any value we can still bring? But then when you ask people for the things they've got questions on and the things they're still trying to figure out, man, it's the same thing has come up, year after year after year after year. So I guess it gives me hope that there will never be people that are not still trying to learn about these things, right? There's always a new stream of people trying to either take it up a notch or tweak their tactics, or there's newer people that are still just getting into this.
Yeah.
So I don't think we'll ever run out of people, Andy, that want to know about doe bedding areas and funnels. So I hope you're ready for a few questions about those. But it's good. It's good because these are those things that are important to have a good handle on, but then also to never settle on. You know what I mean? Like I feel like I'm always still trying to tweak my approach. I'm always still trying to learn like how I can be just a little bit better in this area or a little bit different in this kind of thing. I feel like you're the same way from all of our conversations. Like you're never stuck in the old ways. You're always adjusting and evolving, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I was doing well. I was a successful hunter 15, 20 years ago. Very consistent on multiple good bucks a year. But when I think back of how I hunted then compared to how I hunt now, or even 5 years ago, um, I've changed things and I've adjusted things and I've evolved. And some of that is out of necessity. Some of that is out of just interest in other tactics. Some of that is out of what I find more fulfilling and fun. So yeah, I feel like if you have that mindset of wanting to be a good woodsman, a good hunter, a versatile hunter, it's never ending. I mean, you could spend your whole lifetime learning and trying new things and improving, and you're never gonna. There's no end. There's no end to the possibilities of how skilled you can become and what you can experience and things to learn from other guys. So I'm still
Yeah.
learning from other guys, listening to podcasts, having conversations with different hunters, even guys that are less experienced than me, learning all the time. I take it all in. And, every year I try to up my game in some fashion and
Yeah.
become a more well-rounded hunter. That's just something I care about personally.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm going to try today with these questions. There's going to be some old standbys, like some oldies but goodie type topics we'll talk about, but I'm going to try to think
Mhm.
of some of the new angles on them or little tweaks I've been making in recent years when I can and try to make sure we add something new to the conversation on as much of this as we can too. And so with that
Okay.
said, here's the first question, Andy, and I'll pitch it to you, and then once we hear your thoughts, I'll share whatever additional color I might have. But this one is about something that I know you have preached about for a long time. As long as I've known you, you've been talking about this, which is all day sits. So the question is,
Hmm.
for all day sits, do you recommend staying in the same place all day or switching spots at some point in the day? And if so, when is the best time to make that move? So what do you think about that, Andy?
Yeah, I think it depends on the location. If you're sitting, if you're kind of targeting, say, like a bedding area, I think that it can be good most of the day. Say you're trying to get in tight to a doe bedding area, you're getting into that interior a little bit with the wind advantage. And you're like, this is a really sensitive spot. I'm going to get in real early before light, an hour and a half before light. I'm going to get settled and let all these deer filter back in. And it's very common behavior for mature bucks to let the does filter back into their bedding area, and then they'll kind of stay low key, stay bedded, and then they'll get up late morning, mid to late morning, and then they'll make the rounds, and they'll be
Yeah.
cross sectioning those trails, going in and out of bedding. They'll be going working the downwind sides. They'll be checking like thermal hubs where a lot of scent pools and comes together. So it's very common for the bigger, older, mature bucks to move later in that morning. So a spot like that, I think, can be good most of the day. Yeah. So when you're in a spot like that, if first light comes, there's not a whole lot going on, but what you're trying to do is catch all those does kind of slowly filtering back into the bedding area, and then catch that buck movement. Those bucks checking those areas kind of late morning, and you're in there. You're not trying to sneak in the afternoon and you're bumping does around. You're in there before light. You're in there before the deer theoretically should be back in, and you can catch some great, you know, morning, late morning, and midday movement in there. Where I think those areas tend to kind of taper off is in those evening sits,
Yeah.
are those that evening time frame. I think the does start to kind of work their way out. The bucks know that. The bucks are going to be relating to where they're traveling and where they're heading to. So um, that's one of those spots where I will probably sit it out unless I have like a quick exit where I can go maybe capitalize a little bit closer to a food source or on a travel, between like bed and food, something like that.
Yeah.
Um, I like, funnels between bedding areas. I really like those spots for all day. And again, I think they tend to they tend to be the best. Like if I had to pick a window, I would say like 9 a.m. to like 3 p.m. is like when it's optimal. It doesn't mean you couldn't have a buck strolling through because I mean bucks are on the move. It's not like they're all bedded in the morning, but some are, some aren't. Some are at the food sources, some are following does back in. I mean, there's lots of activity going on, but that's probably your optimal window. But I have had some great sits and some kills first thing in the morning and even last thing at night. Um, I don't I I don't know. I don't move stands a whole lot unless I really think that the evening portion is going to be dead. If I think the evening portion is going to be dead, then yes, I will relocate. Um, I when you ask about a time to do that, I would say um, maybe 2 o'clock. Because I've had so many um, really good encounters, kills, sightings in that 11 to 2 time frame. Another thing that you want to keep in mind during the rut is most guys don't have the mental capacity, the strength and the endurance to sit dark to dark. So 95% of your hunters out there are going to be coming in at 9, 10, or 11. It seems like, those time strips, guys have it in their head. I'm going to sit till 9, I'm going to sit till 10, or I'm going to sit till 11. And then all these guys come in, there's never been more people in the woods other than open day of gun. It's November, it's the rut. Everybody's leaving their stands and they're bumping deer around. They get deer up, stirred up, but does are running. That gets bucks on their feet. So you can capitalize on just the pressure of people moving around at those time frames just by planting your butt in the stand. But there's no way I would leave at like 11 or 12.
Yeah.
I think your chances of seeing deer and buck activity go down as you get to that 11, 12, 1, but your chances of seeing mature bucks actually increase when you hit that kind of like 9, 30, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2. Um,
Now
that
what's
time, that window right there has been very good to me. And I comparatively, I haven't hunted it a whole lot compared to morning and evening.
right. Now what date range, Andy, do you like to start doing those kinds? Like what's the window on the calendar when you will sit that midday period? Because that's a question we got here
Yeah. I
too.
killed my earliest midday kill was on Halloween. I killed him at 12:30. It was a buck down in Illinois. Um, I would say that that would be for me personally that October 30th, 31st in most of the areas here where I hunt. That would be the earliest, and I would probably only do that if I had some really good weather. Good cool weather, below average, like just ideal conditions. But if I was in it for the long haul, if I wasn't me and actually had unlimited time to hunt, I would probably postpone that. I would probably sit till 11, get down, have a break, refresh, get back out there around 2 or 3. But then once, I don't know, maybe November 2nd, 3rd, um, right in there. I mean, every year my trail cameras, my sightings, they light up late morning, midday, right around that November 1st, 2nd, 3rd. So I
Yeah.
think anytime you can do it in that window, from that leading up to in Michigan here, our gun season's November 15th. Anytime you can do that in that window, that's a good thing. And for guys that are like me that have like these little, maybe they don't have an extended amount of time to put in. You're hunting an evening here, a morning there, or maybe you got a midday here because you have your kids' games or whatever. I would not hesitate to get out there at 9 and get in a stand and sit till 1 or 2. I've done it many times, just trying to scratch and claw for time. And it pays off, man. The more time you can be in the tree any time of day in November, you are going to increase your chances. And then use some common sense about where you're located. You don't want to sit in a food source necessarily in the morning, maybe
Hmm.
just off of it if you can catch deer kind of coming off. But then that would be a really bad spot to sit all day,
Yeah.
you know, because you're probably not going to get a lot of midday action there because all the does are back to bed. Those are the spots that are really going to pay off as during a midday sit. Like travel between bedding on the backside of bedding, with a wind advantage, getting into that interior, those spots where you're kind of always afraid to go in because you're going to bump deer. But now it's like it's time.
Now's the
It's time
time.
to take those stabs, take those chances, and they can pay off.
Yeah. Yeah. I 100% agree. I found the same thing. Those are the types of spots that I would want to do those all day sits. I have found, like, just like you said, like that last couple hours of the day, though, those deep back in the bedding area kind of spots can be pretty dead. So if I can, if I have safe access, I will try to bump out closer to where those does are going to go to feed for those evening sits. And usually it's between 2 and 3 is when I would try to do that. But if you can't get out of there without messing things up, if for some reason you would have to be moving through, right where those deer are bedded now, or through the transition area, and there's no way to safely do that, then I will sacrifice the last hour or two, sticking back in the bedding area just so I don't blow it up, because it's worth it for the
Yeah.
first 7, 8, 9, 10 hours. You've got such a good chance back in that area that if my evening sit's not amazing, that's okay if I can't get out there without messing it up for the next day. And I've
Yeah.
always
I got a real, oh, sorry,
no, go ahead.
go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. There's a little delay there, but I had this real quick story about something that almost cost me a really big buck because I didn't have the mental strength to sit all day. So it was during the rut. I can't remember the exact date. It must have been like November. It was like around the 10th or the 12th. This was years ago. But I was sitting in a stand and I was overlooking a river bottom and I saw a buck with a doe, a hot doe locked down. And they were way off on this peninsula. And I had a stand over there where if they worked down the peninsula, they would walk right by it. But they were way past that. They were a good 200 yards past that. And it was 11 o'clock. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to get down at midday and I'm going to make my way over there and get in that stand and sit the rest of the day. Not what I was 400 yards away. Now I'm going to be inside of 80 yards or inside of 100 yards of where they're at. So I get down and I just decided like, oh, they're not gonna do much midday. They're locked down. She's probably bedded. He's probably bedded there with her. They're not gonna move. So I walk back to my truck. I have a sandwich. I lay back for a little bit. I turn on, a little music, and I just kind of shut my eyes for like 15 minutes. 15,
Mm-hmm.
20 minutes. And I was like, man, I gotta get back in there. Probably total it ended up being like 40 minutes. So I walk in, I sneak in, and all of a sudden I'm 40 yards from the tree, and I hear deer get up, and I'm thinking these are other deer, and I hear them kind of run off into the swamp. Well, I make my way to the tree. I start climbing up the tree, and I have my lineman's belt on, and I get about halfway up the tree of where I'm intending to get, and I see that buck and the doe. They had made their way through, and I
Ugh.
bumped them, and they were looking around, and they didn't see me. I was just above like the cover, so I had my bow on a rope. I pulled it up with my lineman belt on, standing on a limb, and ended up ended up shooting that buck.
Wow.
So I totally got lucky, almost blew it, but just that little window, that little tiny window where I hesitated, went back to the truck, almost cost me. Where if I would have been in that stand immediately, I probably would have had a cake shot, and not alerted anything. But I thought that was a good fitting example there.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Um, so speaking of tough decisions during the rut, that being in this case whether to stay or to go in. Another one of those things that we've gotten a number of questions on, and something that I think a lot of us think about, is risk taking during the rut. And one of the questions that I got here is, are you willing to hunt a risky wind during the rut? And there was a second question very similar. Someone else said, like, does wind matter less during the rut? Because on my 20-acre parcel, I never seem to have the just right wind. So is this the time now when I can get risky with it and still, try to make the best of it? Um, what's your take on that?
Um, yeah, I think it is a time to risk. I think you have to think about a lot of things. If you're someone like me, someone like probably most of the listeners out there who work a job, probably have limited vacation time, probably have some family obligations, you're not going to be able to you don't get a rut vacation, you don't get a 2 week window or 3 week window where you can hunt whenever you want. You get your days, you get your windows, maybe you have some flexibility, but I gauge all that stuff, and I weigh that against um, you know, my ideas of where to sit, my decisions, and the risk factor. If I think I'm going to have a limited time, I'm looking at the forecast, I'm looking at the winds moving forward, and it's like, oh man, this is risky, but this might be my only shot, or this might be my best shot. I will risk more. If I have the whole rut to play around with and be maybe a little more patient, I might wait. What I don't want is like what I think is a dead wrong wind.
Yeah.
I don't want dead wrong, but if you're targeting something specific, like a doe bedding area or something, or you kind of know where the majority of the deer bed during the day, I don't want my wind blowing in there all day long. Now would I get on an edge and maybe I'm only clipping a portion of it, a very small portion where maybe a couple deer get me, maybe not. Yeah, that's something I do that all the time. I just kind of trying to base that with the time available, maybe what I think I can get away with, time of year. Another thing too, like always look at like the weather, and if I'm seeing like a high pressure day, if I'm seeing 30-degree temperatures in the morning and it's going to warm up to 55 with a high pressure bluebird day, I know that my thermals are going to be really rising once that sun gets up, at 9, 10, 9:30, 10 o'clock. So I'll be a little more risky on those days than on a low pressure day where it's going to hold my scent kind of down. It's not going to rise. My scent's going to, be more at ground level. I'll be a little more picky on those days. So if I think I'm going to get a scent advantage for a rising thermal, especially like in the hills or something, where you get some elevation changes. Yeah, like a lot of times I almost won't even care about the wind. I just don't want it going down to where I think the deer are going first thing in the morning, and then I'm going to rely on those thermals, for the majority of the day, and then I may adjust, later on in the day to something that's with more of a dropping thermal, or relocate. But
Yeah.
I'm running through all of those things in my head when I'm trying to make a decision. But I've I've never done great on just a dead wrong wind. But on the flip side, it is the rut. There's many times I was targeting a specific buck during the rut, and I was sure he was going to come out of this area, and he ends up coming from a completely opposite area.
Yeah.
So that stuff can happen, and then you get those random bucks that are just passing through, and you don't know where they're coming from, and you always get those buck chasing a doe by your stand. So it can pay. You can go there with a dead wrong wind and get a crack at one, but you're relying a little more on luck, and I don't like to rely on luck. I do want to put myself in likely spots where bucks tend to gravitate towards, and I want a good wind, a good thermal most of the time. I'm not going to be super risky unless I'm just really limited on time. But it's very rare that I'll go out there and hit hunt like with just a dead wrong wind.
Yeah. I think the thing to think about with this a lot of times is yes, like if you're ever going to be a little more risky, this is the time to do it. But you still have to think about like what is the scenario in which this could actually work. Like lots of times when I'm thinking about where to set up or what tree to pick out or where I want to be, I try to envision like, okay, how would this actually work? Like where could a deer actually come through? What's the scenario in what is the scenario that leads to this being successful? And if I'm in there with a wind that I just can't even envision a scenario in which this will really work, even if it's a great place, even if it's somewhere I've wanted to hunt all year and I've waited and waited and waited and gosh, I want to get in there so bad and it's November 7th, it's the right day and it's the end of my trip. But if I sit there and I think to myself, like, even though I really want to be in there, if I look at what the wind's doing and if I sit through and walk through, okay, what's the hypothetical spots this deer could come from? And man, if there's no way it could realistically work out, like you can't wish it to work. So I will still, you still have to like put on your real world glasses. As much as you want to have like the rut fantasy, you also have to say, okay, like what's the real chance of this working? And maybe if you were to get off of that magic spot by 50 yards, now all of a sudden the wind can work and you can still be close to the best places, but at least now there's like a real set of possible scenarios in which deer can come through and not wind you. But if every deer that's going to come into that magic X is going to get your wind, what's the point of being there? So I think, someone has to think that through too.
Yeah.
So yes, this is the time to be risky, but it's not the time to be thoughtless. It's not the time to be careless and imagine that the wind won't still have an effect. It will still have an effect, but you just you're going to have more opportunities for forgiveness. You're going to have more opportunities where, there'll be crazy things going on, like deer doing things you're not expecting. So it's a balancing act, that's for sure. But you said something else, Andy, that I think is worth spending a little time on, which is, the fact that some deer are going to get downwind. Like you're going to, we'll hunt a spot where the wind's going to clip a part of a bedding area or something. So that's not perfect, but it's in the real world, you have to sometimes do that, right? And you and I were texting the other day about, how often do deer actually get downwind of us? How often does that happen? And I think if you were to just watch, hunting TV shows, especially like the folks that've got the big managed properties and they hunt from their blinds and all that kind of stuff all the time, you might think that a deer should never get downwind of you ever, and that these people never get winded, and that if you're going to kill a deer, you can never get winded, and you can never blow your scent anywhere there's deer, and if you do, you're doomed. That might be the impression you could get from watching some of these TV shows. And I think it's important to note that that is not the case in the real world. Right, Andy? I mean, I think I sat down and I tried to think through, like, in just this season's hunts, like how many times did I have deer come downwind of me? Despite the fact that I'm trying really hard to minimize that, you just can't hunt many places in the real world unless you have like a very, very, very well manicured design property in which some deer won't get downwind of you. I think you just have to minimize it. You have to be smart about it. You have to pick your spots, but you always have to give up something. Like if I'm going to push into a spot where I think I can kill something, I'm probably going to have to give something else up. And I want it to be as minimal as possible, and I want it to be as smart as possible. But there are very few perfect deer deserts in a regular, uncontrolled situation where you're hunting by permission properties and things like that. I mean, I think what I told you is that I went through and looked through like all my hunts this season, and on 50% of my hunts, I could say for sure deer got downwind of me. 50% of my hunts. And that is despite me being as careful as I possibly could being smart about it, and actively knowing like, hey, I know I'm going to have deer downwind of me here, but this is the very fewest number of deer or the lowest likelihood type situation that I can get away with. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what prompted that question when I sent it to you. Like, I swear, pretty much, it feels like every hunt I've been on this year, deer have gotten downwind of me. And a lot of that has been due to shifting winds. It's been a really strange year for me as far as like the forecasted wind, and then you get that a little bit, but then you're getting some really oddball winds in there. Like it's supposed to be southwest, and then I'm getting, kind of suckbacks to the east, or it gets down to prime time, that wind really dies down and starts blowing to the north, the complete opposite. That stuff has been happening to me like it seems like every hunt. But yeah, I mean, all the time deer are getting downwind of me. As hard as I try, it's going to happen. And I think you're right. A lot of that stuff you see on TV is it's just not relatable. It's not relatable to the average guy. It's not real to the average guy. So we can only look at that for what it is, and it's just entertainment. That's
Yeah.
all it is.
Yep.
You can't even really listen to the advice of a lot of those guys. Maybe some stuff on deer behavior, but as far as tactic stuff, it anymore, like I've caught on. It goes in one ear right out the other. It's not anything I can apply most times. And it's not anything that's super relatable. You might be able to pick out a few nuggets there, but I think it's important to mention that for the new guys that are coming out, because that's what they're seeing on TV. But yeah, I'm always trying to minimize disturbance. I have my wind a lot of times blowing to where deer shouldn't go, but they do.
Yeah.
Here in Michigan, you have um, a lot of spots I hunt have a fairly high deer density,
Yeah.
and yes, you're maybe targeting the main bedding areas, and the main food sources, and you have your wind in your favor, but then you got all these satellite deer that are bedding over here, and then they're traveling a different way, and you can't account for everyone because there's just too many of them. I get winded far less when I hunt Ohio. There's
Yeah.
less deer. And then another thing too, once you get into a pressured setting, you hunt a pressured state. And I think Dan Johnson experienced this when he came to Michigan. And he's like, I get it now. He's like, the deer exit the bedding areas looking for people.
Hmm.
They're looking up. They're traveling in ways to scent check areas where hunters typically are. All the spots I hunt, a very high percentage of them, that's how the does behave. It's not always just unless you can completely have a place to yourself and it's unpressured, which you can create little pockets like that. These deer are moving very cautiously. They are on high alert from the second they get up. They look like they're ultra paranoid, and they're looking over here, and they hear a squirrel, and they're looking over there, and it's like they are so keyed up all the time. It is really tough, and they get a whiff of where you've been, where you are, and especially the older does, they really key in on that, and they don't forget that, and they start to avoid it, or they come check it out and investigate. And once they have they have a little hint of that you might be there or that you were there, those older does, they come in and they investigate and they get you.
Yeah.
They're when they start looking for you, they're gonna find you. Um, and then it makes things really hard. So it's something we're battling all the time. I mean, I've been battling with it, and I've been getting winded like every single hunt by something. And it's frustrating, man. It's super frustrating, and you're kind of blowing up the area. I think you can minimize that, like you said, hunt the fringes, try to blow into dead areas. And I probably tend to, because I have less time to hunt, I tend to dive in a little deeper than most guys. I think some guys would see my sits and where I go, and they're like, geez, like he's really getting in there, and I do, because I know I'm not going to have many stabs throughout the season. So I try to make those sits count. That's partially it. I'm partially taking a little more risk there.
But
But
I'd
again,
also,
I'm choosing to do that because of time available, and what I'm trying to accomplish on that particular hunt. But
yeah.
yeah, I'm in agreement with you. I mean, it happens. You just try to minimize it.
And I was going to add, I think I can speak for you. You tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but from everything I've heard and seen from the way you hunt, Andy, yes, you push into places and make those aggressive pushes because you have to, given your time and what you're trying to do. But at the same time, you're not stuck with just one
Mhm.
spot to do that. So it's not like you aggressively push into the same spot over and over and over and over again every weekend. You've got all sorts of different places. So you can do an aggressive strike here today, and then you can do an aggressive strike next weekend at a different property. And then the next day you can hunt a piece of public, and then the next weekend you go to some different place. So it's not like you're destroying places and hunting dead spots because of all that aggression. You're moving on and hunting different locations smartly despite that aggression because you have that, array of locations that you can do this on, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and on a spot where you know maybe you lease or maybe you own a small chunk, maybe you can rely on when you're not there, it's not getting blown up by other guys, um, and you have that time. Yeah, I would hunt it a little different. I would hunt it. Um, say you did have a small piece. It doesn't even have to be a big, highly managed farm. You own a small 30 acres or an 80 acres, or you lease an 80 acres, and that's your spot. Yeah, I'm going to be playing things a lot more cautious. I'm going to be hunting the fringes. My whole goal is to not let deer see me, smell me, hear me, but I'm trying to observe. I'm trying to scout. I'm trying to, observe from a distance, maybe check some cameras midday here and there. But I'm trying to let the season kind of materialize and capitalize on the mistakes of the deer, as they, become more active, they cover more ground. I would hunt that different. And I do have spots that have less pressure that I am more of a outside in type hunter. It again, for me personally, it all goes back to the time available. If I have the time available, I'll sit back. I'll sit back and I'll wait and try to be a little more less aggressive and try to maybe prolong that season a little bit and just wait for those bucks to make their mistake.
Yep.
Where other situations, it's like more of a time crunch. I got to make it happen, in the next 4 days. So I'm going to really push. But I don't. I'm not reckless by any means. I move in when I think I can. Like today is 70 degrees. If you were going to say, Andy, or could you go out and get on a good buck today and maybe get him killed? Like, no, I'm not feeling super confident. It's dry, it's crunchy. There's not a lot of wind.
Hmm.
It's 70 degrees. No, I'm not gonna go push and make some aggressive sit. That's very, very low percentage.
Yep.
I'd rather wait till you get a little better conditions for something like that. So,
Yeah.
um,
Here's another small
yeah, I don't know.
property. Here's a follow up to that. Another question someone submitted that's relevant to what we're talking about here. So the question is, when
Okay.
hunting a small property during the rut, so let's say like own a small property, 30 acres, something like that, is it better to hunt off freshly scouted sign? So look for the fresh hot stuff and hunt that, move around a bunch, try to find that, or stick with historically good spots. So I think this kind of goes to the general theme of what we're talking here is do you play a little bit more conservative and not bust up your small property and hunt and trust in some safer but consistently in the past good spots? Or can you move around? Can you aggressively try to find what's happening right now and hunt that? What would you do if you were in that situation, Andy, and let's say you own a 30-acre piece, and these were the two options you were considering? What would you say?
Yeah. Well, I think anytime you're really pigeonholed into a small property like that, it pays off to know that property well. Know where the deer bed, know where they travel, know the if there are some like rut travel through there, some doe bedding, where you can get in and out, and just rely on that. Um, kind of hunt the fringes or hunt those spots that were historically good. Because once you learn that, there could be some changes year to year, depending on like crop rotation, acorn crop, food availability, maybe some surrounding pressure. You got a neighbor hunting a side all of a sudden that never, was there. Those things can come up and change, change some things, change some movement patterns. But if it's a 30-acre piece or less, and maybe it's super sensitive, maybe there's some actual bedding on there. I'm going to be sticking to those historically good spots during the rut. That doesn't mean I'm not ready to go if I observe something. If I observe, just like that example I gave earlier, I'm up in a spot that was a historically good spot right there, and I observed that buck pinned down with that doe out in the marsh there, and I made the move. So I'm ready to make the move. I'm ready to move in on an opportunity, but I'm probably gonna stick to those 2, 3, 4 spots on 30 acres that are typically good during the rut. They're fairly safe with this wind direction, and this spot's fairly safe with this wind direction. And just put in the time. The rut is it. Hunting sign and hunting the rut don't always go hand in hand. So, like when I'm hunting early season, I'm trying to observe, or I'm hunting sign or information off a camera. You start going through October, mid-October, late October, sign is really popping up. Hunting on fresh sign during that window is extremely effective. Like right on sign that maybe is close to good bedding. You see a big track and a scrape. You look around, it's a good security cover. You're like, okay, I think he's coming from here. This is a good spot. I got a really good access here. I got good wind here. You're running this stuff through your head. But then you start getting into November, some of that red hot sign really starts to taper off.
Yeah.
Scrapes start to grow colder and colder as you get into November. You'll see them all torn up every single day, in late October. And then you'll see like November 5th, 6th, 7th, all of a sudden there's leaves in your scrapes, and that lets you know that, okay, it doesn't mean they're gone, but you might not find that fresh torn up sign. You still might, and that lets you know that there's probably one in there. They're probably moving through there. Maybe there's some doe bedding there that they're keying in on. But in a lot of places I've hunted, I switched to hunting terrain. But I don't want just any terrain. I don't want just a saddle. I don't want just a pinch point. I want a pinch point or a saddle or a bench or a travel hub that connects a lot of things that bucks like.
Yeah.
Doe bedding, a primary food source, doe bedding over here, a good ridge over here that has a lot of bedding. And all these things can kind of come together, in one spot. And that's the spot. Now you might go to that spot. There might not be any sign. It might be just a few trails that crisscross, or there might be like a hub scrape down there, or there might be something that indicates this is a spot where a lot of things come together. But it literally could just be one scrape. I've seen that time and time again. When I've hunted in Iowa, I'll find these travel hubs coming off the hills where all these points dump down into the same general area. And you just know, you look at it on a topo and you're like, wow, any buck that's on this ridge and wants to get to this ridge is going to have to come down one of these few points. And then there's this ridge over here that has a point dumping down. And all these are traveling and coming down to the same area, crisscrossing, and they can get to any of these ridges. That spot right there is the hub. That's the travel hub. That's where I'm going to get a lot of deer coming through that general area. And you go down there and you look, and there's a big primary scrape there. Very, very common, but not always. But you go down there, and it doesn't mean it's littered with sign. It might just be 4, 5, 6 trails that all pass through an 80-yard span, and that's where you want to be. You get on that downwind side, you get a good consistent wind pattern, and those are the spots you sit all day. So I don't always need red hot sign during the rut, but I might just be in spots that connect good things. And in those good things, there's probably good sign, like good doe sign, good feeding sign, lots of droppings, deer activity. But I'm not necessarily always in a spot that has red hot sign during the rut.
Yeah. And another thing to remember during that time period is that some red hot sign, laid down at that time of year does not indicate anything about the future, right? Like there will be deer passing through places, like a buck cruising through a zone, and he might lay down a big scrape and he might never pass through there again. So sometimes you'll see sign,
Mm-hmm.
that does indicate like, okay, bucks are doing something here for a reason. But if you see a random scrape or a random rub in a place and you can't say why that's happening there, like if you come to a spot like you're describing, where you've got all these points dropping down and you find this convergence of features, and you think to yourself,
Mm-hmm.
okay, why would deer come through here? Well, it's because of this thing and this thing, this thing. Everything's converging here at this hub. That makes a lot of sense. If I see sign there, I can say like, okay, I understand what's happening and why this sign is here, and this makes a whole lot of sense to hunt. But if you find a big rub or a scrape in, I don't know, on a field edge or in a middle of a big wide open timber, and there's no terrain feature, there's no topography, there's no edge, there's nothing that explains to you like why this should make sense, don't be fooled by that, because a buck could be chasing a random doe on November 7th and then stop for half a second, rip up a scrape while another buck comes in, and then off he goes, and then you're off to the races. So got to remember, like to your point,
Yep.
sign in October is very different than sign in November. And so, I would agree with your assessment of the small property situation. I would probably be more on the conservative side because you can blow up a small property so quickly. And if you have those spots that produce consistently because of a terrain feature, a habitat feature, that's the kind of thing that will work year after year as long as there hasn't been some big change. But I would just preface that, or I guess qualify that, if you're hunting a small property and you're new to it, right, then it doesn't pay to be super conservative all the time. If you've got a short period of time and you don't know the property at all, just playing it super safe your whole vacation because it's small might not be the right approach, right? You got to know it. You have to know what you're working with. So if you've never been able to scout it before, if this is a piece that you're got permission on, let's say, and you're showing up for a week vacation in the rut maybe, and like this is the property you want to hunt, don't go tiptoeing around and never take the time to go learn the thing, because blowing up for one day, even a small property, at least in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong on this, but I would like to learn a property in half a day or a midday or one day, knowing that I'm going to put some pressure on it if that gives me 6 days or 4 days in which I actually know what I'm doing. I want to know what I'm doing. I want to know what's happening. So if you don't have that already, you got to figure that out rather than just blindly sitting and hoping something will happen.
Yeah, and a lot of times, not all. It depends on how the property sits up and what's there. And a lot of times, I've hunted many properties where I would go and check for sign multiple times a week, even small properties. But I'm checking them in areas that aren't alerting deer.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a field edge, with a lot of scrapes, and I can check tracks. And I'll go out there 2, 3 times a week because maybe I'm after a specific buck, or I want to know, when the spot heats up. Maybe I wasn't as familiar with that spot. And I'll go out there and I'll check. Or maybe I'll check a camera. I'm out there, I'm looking, and all of a sudden the scrapes are are opened up, and I look and there's some big tracks in there. Okay, now I'm in a spot where it's not alerting deer. I'm able to walk this without blowing the whole property out, but I picked up sign. Now I'm going to relate that back to what I know about the property, where the bedding areas is, where the funnels are, where I can get in and out, and maybe that tells me it's time to hunt. Not necessarily hunt on that sign, but it's telling me like now's the time to go.
Yeah.
I've had that happen. And I want to make one comment too about when I mentioned, hunting red hot sign and the rut doesn't always go hand in hand. Um, like that spot that I mentioned, where a lot of stuff converges, a lot of travel converges into one general area, and there's a scrape down there. I've found spots like this all across the Midwest, and they're always good spots. You just got to hunt them with the right wind, and you got to have good access. And sometimes when you get down, depending on what it is, sometimes you get down in those bottoms and it can be tough. But a
Yeah.
lot of times you can get the right situation where you can get a consistent wind. But there's a lot of times there's some sort of sign, some sort of primary scrape in these areas where a lot of travel comes together, a lot of scent pulls together. It's because those areas draw bucks. Bucks can gather a ton of information from one spot. And I like to look for spots like that during the rut. I like to hunt spots where bucks can gather a lot of information efficiently without traveling across this field and over here and through this funnel and check this. But they can grab all that information in one spot. And that's something that mature bucks do a lot. A lot of times there is a big primary scrape there, because they get down there, they get all fired up, they scrape. And yes, that's opened up, you know, the third week of October, late October, November 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, it's like torn up. You got a camera on it, you're getting buck after buck after buck. And then all of a sudden, you go in there to hunt and it's November 7th or 8th, and there's leaves covering the scrape. And you're like, oh man, it's dead. It's not dead. They're just not tending the scrape anymore. That scrape is there for a reason, and those bucks are still working through there. They're just not coming and working the scrape. They're covering more. They're covering more ground. They're scent checking more. They're laying down less sign. So just because it's not red hot, because it's not open, doesn't mean it's not a good spot. That big 18 point I killed in Iowa a few years ago, man, I had a camera on that scrape, and I had, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 different nice bucks on that all through like mid-October through like November 2nd or 3rd. It really started to die off. And when I pulled that card, I was like, it was like boom, 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 boom. You know, all these days there's shooter bucks in there. And then it started dying off, you know, as you got into November. And then I went in there and the scrape was like, had leaves all over it. Well, I sat in there because it had a lot of things. It was a downwind side of bedding. It was 3 travel routes, 3 really good travel routes coming from bed to feed that all paralleled each other over like a 200-yard area. And you know, bucks like to cross section those, and they like to travel downwind side of doe bedding. And I'm sandwiched between a major bedding area and a major food source. So I had a lot of things, and it had a good primary scrape there. I sat there. I saw 4 bucks, 2 shooter bucks the first morning before I shot my buck, all traveling through there. Not one of them came and worked the scrape.
Yeah.
But they were scent checking the scrape. You know, they were scent checking it because does would still go by the scrape and they'd, you know, kind of stand in it or walk by it. But that area had several things that bucks look for during the rut. They could gather a lot of information in like a, you know, in like a 50, like 100-yard wide circle. Not even that, like an 80-yard wide circle. They could gather a lot of information in that spot. So even though the sign had tapered down, the buck activity was still off the charts. They're
Yeah.
still moving through there. They're just not working the scrape. So you got to keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's a great reminder. I want to shift to more of like a rapid fire style here, Andy, to knock out some more questions before we wrap this up. So let's do like, we get like 30 seconds to answer or less, like quick first thought on each one of these. And we're going to try and knock out a bunch here to kind of put a bow on this, because there's way more questions than we have time to get through unless we do rapid fire here. So let's try to do that in a few of these. So I got a couple questions here about calling. I'll just combine them into what's your go-to rut calling approach, and then how often do you do that? So real quick, what's your take on that?
I don't mind calling during the rut. I call way less in Michigan in a pressured area. I think it can work really well on 1.5-year-old bucks, 2-year-old bucks, and 3-year-old bucks. I have not had the greatest success calling in, you know, 4-year-old bucks or older in Michigan. I think they've seen it way too many times. I think they're super educated. I would probably give that same advice in any high pressure state. However, I've had awesome luck with it in Iowa, in Illinois, you know, Kentucky, you know, states like that, Ohio even. I've had much better luck with it there. I always carry a grunt tube, always carry a rattle, and I'm pretty good with a mouth snort wheeze. I'm not afraid to do it. I'm not a huge blind caller unless I'm in a state and I'm just not seeing the activity. Things maybe are a little slow. It's not my favorite thing to do, but I'm not afraid to do it. It can definitely work. And I'll do it maybe when the action's a little slow, or I see a buck, you know, cruising, looks like he's in the mood. I'm in a good situation where I call, you know, a good approach for him, then I'll throw it at him. But I don't do a ton of. I know a lot of guys will rattle like every 30 seconds or so, every 30 minutes during the
There might
rut.
be some guys who
I
do
don't
it every
really do
30
that.
seconds. um, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say I am very similar. I never blind call in Michigan. And I mean, I would basically say I never rattle in Michigan either. I will grunt or snort wheeze if there's a buck out of range I'm trying to bring in. Um, and then in those unpressured states, Iowa, Kansas, whatever out there, I will occasionally do a blind rattling session. But even then, like that'll be like late morning kind of thing. I might try that and might try that like twice, maybe separated by an hour or something like that. But I don't do a whole lot of that.
Mhm.
But I very much will grunt and snort wheeze at deer and or would rattle to deer out of range in those kinds of states too. Have had a lot of luck with grunts and snort wheezes. That's been my most effective calling technique at this time of year. First start with like a contact grunt. Like, so if I see a buck 150 yards away or something, I'll try a brah and just get louder until I see he's actually heard it. And if I can get a visual of him in which he turns and like 100% has heard my thing, then I won't call. I'll stop as soon as I know he heard me. And then I'm assessing his body language. And, if he starts coming my way, then I'm done. I'm not going to call anymore, nothing else. If that buck seems interested, maybe pins his ears back and takes a few steps, makes a scrape, but then kind of starts heading off in the other direction again, like he gave me a little bit of an interest, but not all the way, then that might be when I give him the, flipping the bird by giving him that snort wheeze and like really try to get him fired up just one notch higher. And sometimes that works. So that would be my one other thing to add on the rut calling. Next question is about snacks, Andy, for all day sits. Healthy food or junk
Mhm.
food?
I usually have a water. I usually have about 15 gummy bears. That's very specific.
Yes, it is.
I'll do like five, like a little handful 3 times a day. And then I usually have a big Ziploc of trail mix and maybe like a granola bar or a protein bar. I keep it very minimal. If I feel like I'm gonna be really hungry, I'll stack up more on the trail mix. Um, Occasionally maybe a peanut butter jelly, but I don't even do that much. But I try not to eat a ton or have a ton of snacks, and I don't like to be moving around and making noise and stuff, but I have to eat something. And my blood sugar tends to fall a little low, and that's why I do the gummy bears.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't take a bunch of junk typically, but that doesn't mean I don't eat a bunch of junk food during hunting season, because I definitely do.
So I'm a little different than you in that I do bring a lot of stuff because I just know myself. Like I time out my snacks to like every hour. I'll give myself that little thing to be excited about. So I'll usually start snack time. Like if it's an all day sit, my snack time usually starts like 10 a.m. maybe. And then I'll do like every hour from then. I've got some little thing to look forward to. So I know like, all right, I got the little Snickers bar at 10. And then if I can make it to 11, I know I can have the trail mix. And if I can make it to noon, then I get my peanut butter jelly. And if I can make it to 1, then I'll get my apple. And if I can make it to 2, then I'll let myself have the cheese crackers or whatever. So I do bring a bunch of
Yeah.
snacks, but I what I try to do now is I take everything out of the noisy wrappers ahead of time and package them in
Hmm.
reusable Ziploc bags. And so I like the reusable Ziplocs. I don't always do this, but when I'm on top of my A game, I use those because they're very quiet. They're not like crinkly at all. So they're like very silent
Yeah.
and you can have, you can access your snacks in a quiet way. And then you're also not accumulating, a whole bucket full of trash throughout a day, which is nice. Um, and I do a mixture of like healthy and junk. So I used to be heavier on the junk. I've tried to add more like some fruits and something healthy in there because after you do that for a week or so, you'll start feeling really cruddy if it's nothing but junk. So I'm kind of in between on that one. Um, Here's another location related one, Andy. We've talked a lot about bedding areas. This person asked, when you're hunting downwind of a doe bedding area, how close do you actually want to be on it? Like, are you inside the doe bedding area on the downwind side, or are you outside of the doe bedding downwind of it? And if so, like, what's the distance to the edge of that cover or the edge of wherever you think the does are bedded? How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a tough one because it could vary, location to location. Um, I picture like a creek bottom that has red brush and kind of marshy habitat like on each sides of the creek, and essentially the whole creek serves as like really good doe bedding, on all the creek bends and all the little thickets and stuff. And I'll get on the interior of that. Obviously I'll find a good tree, and I try to get where I can kind of shoot into where I think a lot of the travel is going to be. But I don't want my wind necessarily blowing out a lot of travel opportunities behind me. It's not like doe bedding isn't always like a hard edge. You know what I mean? It's a lot of
Yeah.
times you just know um, you're kind of working in there, and things get a little thicker, and there might be a pocket of does here, and then some more, 100 yards back, or so it's not as always like as a well defined abrupt edge as it might sound like when we say that. So a lot of it is a feel thing, but I try to get where I can cover um, travel. And a lot of times there will be, some sort of sign or some sort of, perpendicular trail. It may not be beat to the ground. It may be able to pick up on it. And sometimes you can't because it's just used a few times a year, during that short window. But I don't like to give up too much travel behind me, if that makes sense. So I
Yeah.
will get into usually where it starts to kind of thicken up, um, or I feel like I'm getting into that interior. And if I start getting in any further, I'm going to start bumping deer around. That usually tells me to hold up and kind of get right on there, right on that edge. Sometimes it's a feel thing, sometimes it's a visual thing, but that kind of I let my instincts gauge a little bit there if there's not like a clear indication of sign that tells me, this is probably where I need to be. But one thing I'll mention real quick, the downwind side of doe bedding is an area that bucks will gravitate to during the rut, no doubt about it. But I've seen more and more over the years that the the side where does tend to travel from food to bed. There's, a lot of times if there's a distinct, um, food source, and the general travel is from here to through the bedding, that spot, that edge there where they travel in and out, where a lot of those trails might be coming in from, various spots, various directions, that spot gets a lot more, or it gets a lot of activity from bucks, maybe even more so than the downwind side.
Yeah.
They can take a one trail perpendicular, and they can cover, 2, 3, 6, 12 different entrance trails and know exactly what's in that doe bedding. And they can do the same thing traveling from downwind, but I've seen it more and more over the years. I've almost changed my opinion a little bit that might even be the better spot, the spot where they can go perpendicular and cover a lot of trails. So if you have a good bedding area and a good food source over here, and in that bedding area, maybe it's a 100-yard, 200-yard stretch, and there are multiple trails kind of going in. You see, this one's well beat down, this one's a little more faint, another beat down one there, another one in the corner. That inside that timber, or inside that cover there's going to be some sort of route, perpendicular trail. It may be visible, it may not be, but that spot right there is a great spot to be. At that I've seen that over and over the last few years. I've really started to key in more on that than necessarily the downwind side.
Yeah. I mean, it's that. I mean, it's the same kind of like transition type area that a lot of folks would hunt during that bed to feed pattern of October. But now, the does are still basically
Hmm.
doing the same thing, right?
Yep.
Does are still basically on that bed to feed pattern, transitioning out to that food source. But now, instead of the bucks doing that same thing, like you said, they're not paralleling that movement anymore. They're perpendicularing it, crossing it to catch all those
Hmm.
trails. So you're spot on. That's a very good point. And that's a situation where you can get that kind of location is a best of both worlds for an all day sit. Where we talked about at the beginning, how if you're hunting downwind of a doe bedding area, that can be great in the morning, in the afternoon. But then once you get to the evening, when they transition out to their food source, that spot can kind of die off in some locations when you're deep back in the bedding. Well, if you find a spot like this, where you're adjacent to bedding, but you're also where they are transitioning through as they head to that main food source, that's the kind of place that does stay pretty darn primo right on through. So it's finding the right wind for that can
Yep.
be tricky, I think, but a great spot.
Yeah.
Last question, or maybe second to last question. Should you still consider trail camera pictures in specific areas during the rut? So when you get new pictures that show you a buck that did something yesterday or a week ago or whatever, but it's November now, is that something that it's really meaning much to you, Andy?
No, I still pay major attention to that, especially like if it's on. Well, I mean, honestly, I'm probably not diving into too many like bedding areas to check trail cameras. That time of year, those might be more of like a soaker camera where I keep it in there, most of the year. But like I'll have them on funnels, especially like really good funnels where they're almost forced to go through there. Um, and I'll definitely check those and see what's kind of moving through there because those are spots that it's it could be a random buck that's coming through one time, but if it's a buck that's in there during the rut, there are spots, there are areas, there are trees that these deer go by repetitively, and it may not be every day, but it might be 3, 4, 5 times a week. In those spots, it pays to know when those spots are heating up because those are the spots where if you're after a specific buck, and if in a lot of times just any good buck, but specifically a specific buck, if you can find those areas where they go through more than anywhere else, and you can plant yourself there and just put in the hours. Obviously, play in the wind. Getting there when the wind is okay, but plant your butt in there and just playing the long game. That's a great way to kill a target buck during the rut. But you gotta kind of establish that spot. Maybe there's a couple of them. Maybe you're lucky and you got two of them on the property you can hunt or whatever. And another one is the food source. Um, I that's still valuable to me to know that, like, okay, after dark, there's some does in these food source, and then after dark I got a buck on trail camera like bumping does around or working the scrape. I mean, that tells me that he's in there, and now I can make an educated plan on where I want to hunt this deer. Maybe it's in this funnel coming to the food source. Maybe it's on the backside of this doe bedding. Maybe it's on the food source. Maybe he's in there in daylight a little bit. So I think trail cam. I actually check trail cameras a little more often during the rut. But I'm also doing it smart, and I'm also, um, I'm trying to not blow deer out. I'm just trying to get some information on something that I could potentially capitalize on the short term, on a short term pattern there.
Yeah. Hypothetical, well, last question. Hypothetical dream spot to sit during the rut. So if you could paint the picture of the perfect rut location and tell me the day you would want to hunt this perfect spot, and then give me as much detail as you can about what that setup would look like. Everything from access to what kind of tree to what features or habitat or sign is there. What's the perfect place you could dream up for a rut sit?
Okay. So access would be through a neighboring property that's a cattle pasture. And I could walk through that the majority of the way back there. And this is going to be in like, not like real super steep hill country, but hill country, like moderately sized hills, 100 feet, 150 feet, somewhere in there, kind of rolling hills with, but some big hills in some sort of travel hub where there's 2, 3 different ridge systems that they all kind of dump down in the same general area. And in that bottom, it's a wide bottom. That's a CRP field. Okay. And I'm actually describing a
I
spot
like
that
this
I've
a lot.
hunted and have killed. Yeah. Have killed multiple bucks, and my buddy shot a monster in there too. So You got ridges on the sides, kind of surrounding it with multiple points dumping down into this CRP field. And right down there at the bottom is the primary scrape, the hub scrape. And because that bottom is a skinny field and it's wider, you can actually get a good consistent wind when you have the wind blowing out the direction of the main drainage. So it's kind of wind specific. You don't want it coming over a ridge perpendicular. You want it blowing out that main drainage. And what you can do is put that wind in your face, get down in that bottom, and get right downwind of that scrape. And then you got all these points coming down, and then you got the wind hitting you in the face, blowing you back up towards that cattle pasture. Yes, a couple deer, there's some space to get, deer could get behind you, but it's going to be very minimal, very, very minimal disturbance, not real obtrusive. And you just got so many things coming together there all in one spot. You got travel hub, multiple points dumping down. So you're going to have deer coming from all directions. You got that primary scrape there, and you got the thermal activity of falling thermals, first thing in the morning, until that sun gets over those hills, you got falling thermals going right down into that spot. So it's a great spot for bucks to come and check crossing trails, scent cooling down, and the same thing in the evening. That's something like that is a killer spot. And they're hard to find, but what I look for is multiple features that bucks like all in one area. That's really what it comes down to. That's what makes a great rut spot.
Yeah.
Any one of those things you can get a kill on. Any one of those things can be a great hunt. But when you find a spot like that, that's what makes a spot great for decades.
Yeah.
It's always a good spot because it has everything a buck needs, and he can figure out a ton of information from a lot of different things in one specific area.
Yeah.
So, and then as far as a date, I would throw November. I'm going to make a real short window, 6 through 9.
Nice.
November 6 through 9. Yeah.
Yeah, I've begun thinking of places like that as like a stacked. I've been calling like a stacked location because I want to stack up like all these reasons a buck would pass through there. So you make such a good point, which is any one of those in isolation could be good, and it could work. But which like the best of the best places are when you can find this thing stacked on this thing, stacked on this thing, stacked on this thing, and you have all of these reasons, and then you all of a sudden you have a much higher percentage sit, and that's what you're really looking for. So I love it, man. I hope you find a spot or two like that to hunt in this next couple weeks, and that you get a big one on the ground, my friend. I appreciate you taking the time to do this and answering some of these questions and helping us all get hyped for this most wonderful time of year.
Yeah, man, it's awesome. I'm excited. Hopefully this helped the listeners. I had fun. These are fun questions. It's fun just to start brainstorming and think about this stuff because when you don't talk about it, sometimes you get a little complacent. You're not really thinking about it, but I'm all jacked up now. I'm ready to get out there.
Me too, man. And on that note, I should probably slip out of here and head to the woods here myself. So thank you, Andy, and thanks everyone for listening. I appreciate you joining us this week. Good luck out there, and until next time, stay wired to hunt.